October 24th, 2023, Jacksonville, Florida. 12:17 a.m. A construction worker sits in his pickup truck outside a Walmart, blood covering his hands, calmly waiting for police to arrive. When they ask him what happened, his response chills them to the bone. "I just killed my wife and her lover." Inside the store, two bodies lie motionless in a manager's office. A marriage of 12 years is over. Two families are shattered forever. And the most shocking part? This wasn't some stranger breaking into their workplace. This was a husband who discovered a secret that pushed him past the point of no return. 38-year-old Michael Thompson had never been arrested, never been in a fight, never showed any signs of violence. His neighbors called him the ideal family man, devoted father, hard-working husband, the guy who'd help you move furniture on a Saturday morning. So what transformed this ordinary suburban dad into someone capable of double murder? What secret had his wife Sarah been keeping that was worth killing for? And how did one moment of discovery lead to 22 minutes of unthinkable violence in the back aisles of America's most familiar store? This case will force you to question everything you think you know about the people closest to you, because sometimes the person sharing your bed, raising your children, and kissing you goodnight has been living a completely different life. And when that truth finally comes out, ordinary people can do extraordinary things. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Tonight, we're taking you inside a case that shattered 3 families and left an entire community asking one haunting question: how well do we really know the people closest to us? Meet Michael Thompson, devoted husband, caring father of 2 young children, hard-working construction foreman who never missed a day of work. His neighbors described him as quiet, reliable, the kind of man who'd help you move furniture or fix your fence without asking for anything in return. Then there's Sarah Thompson, his wife of 12 years, store manager at the local Walmart, beloved by her employees, always the first to volunteer for overtime shifts. She had that infectious laugh that could brighten anyone's day, and she seemed to genuinely care about every person who worked under her. But lately, Michael noticed something different about Sarah. She was working later hours, coming home with stories about difficult customers and inventory problems. She seemed distant, distracted, like her mind was somewhere else entirely. And finally, there's David Martinez, Sarah's assistant manager. 29 years old, recently divorced, known around the store for his easygoing personality and willingness to take on extra shifts. David had been working closely with Sarah for about 8 months, helping her implement new store policies and manage the evening crew. To everyone who worked there, they seemed like the perfect professional partnership, efficient, friendly, always laughing together about some inside joke from their shift. But behind closed doors, something else was happening. Was this a crime of passion sparked by a moment of discovery, or was it the result of weeks of growing suspicion and carefully planned revenge? Was the affair between Sarah and David real, or was it all in Michael's head, the paranoid delusions of a man slowly losing his grip on reality? And how did one of America's most ordinary places become the setting for such extraordinary violence? To understand how this tragedy unfolded, we need to go back to the beginning. Michael and Sarah met in 2011 at a mutual friend's barbecue in Jacksonville. She was 24, he was 26. Sarah had just graduated from business school and was working as a shift supervisor at a local grocery store, dreaming of climbing the corporate ladder. Michael was establishing his construction business, pouring everything he had into building something that would provide security for his future family. Friends who knew them then described their relationship as solid, built on shared values and genuine respect for each other's ambitions. They married 2 years later in a small ceremony at Sarah's childhood church, surrounded by family and friends who could see how deeply in love they were. Michael would surprise Sarah with her favorite coffee every morning before she left for work. Sarah would pack elaborate lunches for Michael, complete with little handwritten notes tucked inside. They bought a modest 3-bedroom house in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where kids ride bikes in the street and neighbors know each other's names. Their first child, Emma, was born in 2014, followed by their son, Jake, 2 years later. Michael threw himself into fatherhood with the same dedication he brought to his construction projects. He coached Jake's Little League team, never missed one of Emma's dance recitals, and spent his weekends building elaborate tree houses and swing sets in their backyard. Sarah balanced motherhood with her growing career ambitions, eventually landing the store manager position at Walmart in 2019, a job that came with better pay, good benefits, and the respect she craved. For years, everything seemed perfect from the outside. The Thompsons were the family that other couples aspired to be, but sometime in early 2023, cracks began to show. Michael later told police that Sarah started working later hours, claiming she needed to stay after closing to handle inventory and paperwork. She began receiving text messages at all hours, messages she would quickly delete after reading. When Michael asked about them, Sarah would say it was just work. Suppliers asking questions, corporate sending updates, employees calling in sick. The distance between them grew slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. Sarah stopped packing those little lunch notes. Their conversations became focused entirely on logistics. Who was picking up the kids, who was handling dinner, who was dealing with homework and bedtime routines. They stopped talking about their dreams, their fears, their hopes for the future. They became roommates managing a household rather than partners building a life together. Michael tried to rationalize what he was seeing. Sarah's job was stressful, managing a store with over 100 employees, dealing with corporate pressure to meet sales targets, handling customer complaints and employee issues. Of course she was tired when she came home. Of course she was distracted. He told himself he was being paranoid, that the problems in their marriage were normal growing pains that every couple faced after a decade together. But then David Martinez entered the picture. Sarah mentioned him casually at first, the new assistant manager who was helping her reorganize the store's operations. David was experienced, having managed stores in Tampa and Orlando before transferring to Jacksonville for a fresh start after his divorce. Sarah spoke about him with an enthusiasm that Michael hadn't heard in her voice for months. David understood the retail business. David had innovative ideas for improving customer service. David stayed late to help her with projects that previous assistant managers had always left for her to handle alone. Michael noticed other changes too. Sarah started caring more about her appearance before work, buying new clothes and spending extra time on her makeup. She mentioned David's name more frequently in casual conversation. David said this, David thought that, David helped her solve this problem or handle that difficult customer. When Michael suggested they go out for dinner or plan a weekend getaway, Sarah always seemed to have some work obligation that David needed her help with. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in October. Michael had surprised the kids with tickets to a movie they'd been wanting to see, and he called Sarah to see if she could leave work a little early to join them. When he called the store, an employee told him that Sarah and David had left together about an hour earlier, saying they needed to check on some vendor delivery at the regional warehouse. But when Michael called Sarah's cell phone, she said she was still at the store, buried in paperwork, and couldn't possibly get away. That night, after Sarah came home with apologies and explanations about supply chain issues and corporate deadlines, Michael lay awake staring at the ceiling. For the first time in their marriage, he was certain his wife had lied to him. And then came the night when he decided to follow her. Tuesday, October 24th, 2023. Sarah kissed Michael goodbye at 6:30 p.m., same as always. She told him she'd probably be home by 11, that she and David needed to finish the quarterly inventory report before the regional manager's visit on Thursday. Michael helped the kids with homework, made sure they brushed their teeth, and read them their bedtime stories. But instead of settling in to watch television like he normally did, Michael got in his pickup truck and drove to the Walmart parking lot. He parked across the street at a gas station where he had a clear view of the store entrance. The parking lot was mostly empty, just a few employee cars clustered near the building and the occasional customer running in for last-minute essentials. Michael sat there for nearly 2 hours, telling himself this was crazy, that he was destroying his marriage based on paranoid suspicions. He was about to drive home when he saw them. Sarah and David emerged from the employee entrance together, not walking with the casual distance of coworkers, but close enough that their shoulders almost touched. They were laughing about something, and as they reached Sarah's car, David placed his hand on the small of her back, a gesture so intimate and natural that it could only come from months of hidden familiarity. Sarah didn't pull away. Instead, she turned to face him, and for a moment, they stood there looking into each other's eyes like lovers saying goodbye after a secret meeting. Michael's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles went white. The rational part of his mind tried to explain what he was seeing. Maybe David was just being friendly. Maybe Sarah was going through something at work that Michael didn't understand. Maybe this was all perfectly innocent. But his heart was pounding, and a voice in his head kept repeating the same phrase, "She's cheating on you. She's been cheating on you." David got into his own car and drove away. Sarah sat in her car for several minutes, and Michael could see the glow of her phone screen as she typed what looked like a long text message. Then she drove home, arriving at exactly 11:15 p.m., with stories about how exhausting the inventory work had been, and how grateful she was that David had stayed late to help her finish everything. For the next 3 days, Michael couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything except the image of his wife standing so close to another man. He found himself checking her phone when she was in the shower, looking through her text messages and call logs. But Sarah was careful. If there were incriminating messages, she was deleting them immediately. He considered hiring a private investigator, confronting Sarah directly, or even calling David to demand an explanation. But part of him was terrified of what he might discover. On Friday evening, Sarah announced she had to work late again. Michael nodded and said he understood, but after she left, he called in a favor from his brother to watch the kids and drove back to the Walmart parking lot. This time, he didn't park across the street. This time, he was going to find out the truth. The store closed at 11 p.m., and by 11:30, most of the employee cars had left the parking lot. But Sarah's Honda and David's Toyota were still there, parked side by side near the loading dock. Michael sat in his truck, watching the building, trying to work up the courage to go inside. The employee entrance was usually locked after closing, but he knew Sarah often left it propped open when she was working late, in case she needed to step outside for fresh air. At 11:45, Michael made his decision. He walked across the empty parking lot, his footsteps echoing off the asphalt. The employee door was indeed propped open, and Michael stepped into the familiar fluorescent-lit maze of Walmart aisles after closing. The store felt different at night, larger, emptier, almost ghostly. He could hear voices coming from the back of the store, near the stockroom where Sarah's office was located. As he got closer, he could make out Sarah's laugh, that same infectious laugh that had made him fall in love with her 12 years earlier. But now it felt like a knife twisting in his chest. He crept between the towering shelves, following the sound of their voices, until he reached the stockroom area. The door to Sarah's office was closed, but there was a window that looked out onto the stockroom floor. What Michael saw through that window would replay in his mind every day for the rest of his life. Sarah and David were behind her desk, locked in an embrace that was unmistakably romantic. David's hands were tangled in Sarah's hair. Sarah's arms were wrapped around his neck. They were kissing with the passion of people who had been denying their feelings for months and had finally given in to temptation. Later, Michael would tell police that something snapped inside his brain at that moment. The betrayal, the lies, the months of growing suspicion all crystallized into a rage so pure and focused that it felt like a physical force taking control of his body. He didn't remember making the decision to burst into the office. He didn't remember grabbing the box cutter from the utility cart in the stockroom. He didn't remember Sarah's scream when she saw him, or David's attempts to shield her with his own body. What he did remember was the moment when the red haze cleared from his vision, and he found himself standing in Sarah's office with blood on his hands and 2 bodies at his feet. Sarah was crumpled behind her desk, her eyes wide and empty, a pool of crimson spreading beneath her head. David was slumped against the wall, his shirt torn and stained, one hand still reaching toward Sarah as if he had died trying to protect her. Michael stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, trying to understand how his life had gone from ordinary suburban routine to this moment of unimaginable violence. Then he pulled out his phone and dialed 911. When the dispatcher asked him to describe his emergency, Michael's voice was eerily calm. "I just killed my wife and her lover. I'm at the Walmart on Phillips Highway. You need to send someone." When the dust settled, 2 people lay dead in an office that smelled like cleaning supplies and coffee. But that was only the beginning of this story. If you're still watching, drop a comment with Florida. Let's see who's following every twist. The Jacksonville Sheriff's Office received Michael's 911 call at 12:17 a.m. on Saturday morning. The dispatcher later said she had handled thousands of emergency calls during her 15-year career, but the calm, matter-of-fact way Michael described what he had done still gives her nightmares. When officers arrived at the Walmart, they found Michael sitting in his pickup truck in the parking lot, his hands covered in blood, waiting for them with an almost supernatural patience. Detective Maria Rodriguez was the lead investigator assigned to the case. A 22-year veteran of the force, she had worked homicides involving gang violence, domestic disputes, and robbery gone wrong. But walking into that Walmart stockroom in the early hours of Saturday morning, she knew immediately that this case was different. The scene was contained to Sarah's office. There were no signs of struggle elsewhere in the store, no evidence that the violence had spilled out into the main retail area. It was as if Michael had channeled all his rage into those few minutes in that small room. Sarah Thompson was found behind her desk, multiple stab wounds to her chest and neck. David Martinez was slumped against the office wall, defensive wounds on his hands and arms, suggesting he had tried to protect Sarah before succumbing to his own injuries. The box cutter Michael used as a weapon was on the floor near David's body, covered in blood and fingerprints that would later confirm what everyone already knew. Michael Thompson had killed 2 people in a fit of jealous rage. But as Detective Rodriguez began interviewing Michael at the police station, she realized that this wasn't going to be a simple case of a husband catching his wife with another man and losing control. Michael was remarkably composed, answering every question with detailed precision, showing no signs of the mental break that might explain such sudden violence. He described months of suspicion, careful observation of his wife's behavior, and the premeditated decision to follow her to work that night. This wasn't a spontaneous crime of passion. It was something much more calculated. The investigation moved quickly. Security cameras from the Walmart parking lot confirmed Michael's timeline. His truck could be seen arriving at 11:42 p.m. and parking near the employee entrance. The cameras showed Michael walking into the store at 11:47 p.m. and emerging at 12:09 p.m., meaning the entire confrontation and double murder had taken place in less than 22 minutes. The footage also captured Sarah and David's earlier interaction in the parking lot, lending credence to Michael's claims about their affair. But when detectives examined Sarah and David's phones, the evidence was more complicated than anyone expected. Yes, there were text messages between them that suggested a relationship beyond professional collaboration. Messages about meeting after work, messages with inside jokes and emoji that implied intimacy, messages deleted shortly after being sent. But there were also messages that painted a different picture. David expressing concerns about Sarah's marriage, Sarah talking about her guilt over having feelings for someone else, both of them acknowledging that they were crossing lines they shouldn't cross. The most damning evidence came from Sarah's personal journal, discovered in her desk drawer at home. In entries dating back several months, Sarah had documented her growing feelings for David, her confusion about what those feelings meant, and her guilt over betraying Michael and the children. But she had also written extensively about her fear that Michael was becoming suspicious, her worry that he was following her, and her growing anxiety about confronting the problems in their marriage. One entry, dated just 3 days before her death, read, "I know what I'm doing is wrong. I know I'm hurting Michael even though he doesn't know it yet. But I feel alive when I'm with David in a way I haven't felt in years. I need to tell Michael the truth. I need to ask for a separation so we can both figure out what we really want. I can't keep living this lie." The community response was immediate and intense. The Walmart where Sarah had worked was closed for 3 days while police processed the crime scene, but when it reopened, customers and employees left flowers and cards near the customer service desk. Sarah had been popular with both her staff and regular customers, known for remembering people's names and always being willing to solve problems with a smile. David, too, was remembered as someone who genuinely cared about doing his job well and treating people with respect. But public opinion was divided about Michael. Some people saw him as a victim of betrayal, a hard-working man pushed to the breaking point by his wife's infidelity. Others saw him as a cold-blooded killer who had chosen violence over communication, murder over divorce. Social media exploded with debates about marriage, infidelity, and whether anything could justify what Michael had done. The media coverage was relentless. Cable news shows featured panels of experts debating the psychology of workplace affairs, the warning signs of domestic violence, and the legal distinctions between crimes of passion and premeditated murder. Tabloids sensationalized the story with headlines like "Walmart Love Triangle Massacre" and "Till Death Do Us Part, Husband's Revenge in Aisle 12." The story became a national symbol of everything wrong with modern marriage, workplace relationships, and America's violence problem. But for Detective Rodriguez, the case was becoming more complex with every piece of evidence she uncovered. Michael's story was consistent, but there were details that didn't quite add up. Security footage from earlier dates showed that Michael had been to the Walmart parking lot several times in the weeks before the murder, suggesting a level of surveillance and planning that contradicted his claims of sudden discovery. Financial records showed that he had researched divorce lawyers and private investigators, but had never contacted any of them, as if he were looking for information, but not ready to act on it. And then, detectives uncovered something that changed the entire trajectory of the case, something Michael had never mentioned in any of his interviews, something that made his carefully constructed narrative of betrayed husbands suddenly seem much more complicated. 3 weeks into the investigation, Detective Rodriguez received a call that would turn the entire case upside down. David Martinez's ex-wife, Christina, had been following the news coverage and wanted to share information that she thought might be relevant. When Rodriguez met with Christina at a coffee shop in downtown Jacksonville, what she learned made her question everything she thought she knew about Michael Thompson's motive. According to Christina, David had been receiving threatening messages for several weeks before his death. Messages that seemed to come from Michael, though they were sent from anonymous email accounts and untraceable phone numbers. The messages weren't just about the affair with Sarah. They contained detailed information about David's daily routine, his home address, his financial problems following his divorce, and threats against his family members who lived in other states. David had been so frightened that he had contacted the police twice, but without concrete evidence of who was sending the threats, there was little they could do. Christina had printouts of some of the messages David had shown her. One, sent just 5 days before the murder, read, "You think you can steal another man's wife and there won't be consequences? You think you can destroy a family and walk away? I know where you live. I know where your sister works. I know what time your mother goes to her doctor appointments. Stop what you're doing with Sarah, or everyone you care about will pay the price." This evidence suggested that Michael hadn't just discovered his wife's affair on that Friday night. He had known about it for weeks, possibly months. He had been planning some kind of confrontation or revenge, not acting in a moment of sudden rage. But when Detective Rodriguez confronted Michael with this information, his response was unexpected. He broke down completely, sobbing in the interview room like a man whose carefully constructed facade had finally crumbled. What Michael revealed next shocked even the experienced detective. Yes, he had known about Sarah and David's relationship for much longer than he had originally claimed. Yes, he had been sending threatening messages to David, trying to scare him away from his wife. But the decision to go to the Walmart that night hadn't been about catching them in the act. It had been about begging Sarah to give their marriage another chance. Michael's real plan, he claimed, was to wait until David left and then confront Sarah alone. He wanted to tell her that he knew about the affair, that he was willing to forgive her, that they could work through this together for the sake of their children. He had even written a letter expressing his feelings, a letter that was found in his truck after the arrest. The letter was heartbreaking in its vulnerability. A man trying to save his marriage by acknowledging his own failures as a husband and promising to be better. But when Michael saw Sarah and David together that night, when he witnessed the intimate way they touched each other, something inside him snapped in a way he hadn't anticipated. All his careful planning, all his hopes for reconciliation, all his dreams of rebuilding their family, everything evaporated in an instant of pure, consuming rage. He wasn't just angry about the affair, he was angry about the months of lies, the way Sarah had made him feel crazy for suspecting what was obviously true, the way she had come home every night and kissed him goodnight while planning to leave him for another man. The prosecution team, led by Assistant District Attorney James Harrison, saw this revelation as proof that Michael had planned the murders. The threatening messages, the surveillance of the Walmart, the decision to bring a weapon, all evidence of premeditation. Even if Michael claimed he only intended to talk to Sarah, he had entered that store prepared for violence. The fact that he had researched David's personal life, learned his schedule, and systematically intimidated him for weeks showed a pattern of calculated behavior that went far beyond a moment of passion. But Michael's defense attorney, Sarah Martinez, no relation to the victim, argued that her client was a man who had been psychologically tortured by his wife's betrayal. The threatening messages were the desperate attempts of a man trying to save his marriage without directly confronting the painful truth. The decision to go to the store that night was motivated by love, not revenge. Michael wanted to win his wife back, not hurt her. The violence that followed was a genuine mental break, the result of seeing the woman he loved in another man's arms after months of gaslighting and deception. The trial became a media sensation, with cameras allowed in the courtroom and legal experts offering daily commentary on cable news shows. The prosecution presented evidence of Michael's planning and premeditation, painting him as a controlling husband who couldn't accept his wife's autonomy. They brought in Sarah's co-workers, who testified about how happy she seemed in the months before her death, how she had talked about feeling trapped in her marriage and finding new purpose in her relationship with David. The defense focused on Michael's mental state, bringing in psychiatrists who testified about the psychological effects of infidelity and betrayal. They argued that Michael had suffered a dissociative episode, a temporary break from reality that made him legally not responsible for his actions. They painted Sarah as a woman who had emotionally abused her husband by lying about her affair while continuing to share his bed and raise their children together. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when Michael took the stand in his own defense. Speaking directly to the jury, he described the moment he saw Sarah and David together with such raw emotion that several jurors were seen wiping away tears. He talked about the 12 years of marriage, the dreams they had shared, the life they had built together. He talked about lying awake at night wondering what he had done wrong, how he had failed as a husband, why the woman he loved more than life itself was pulling away from him. But when the prosecution cross-examined Michael, they focused on the threatening messages, the stalking behavior, the weeks of planning that preceded the murder. They forced him to read some of his own words aloud, threats against David's family, descriptions of what he wanted to do to the man who was destroying his life. They painted a picture of a man who had become obsessed with revenge, who had chosen violence over the dozens of healthier options available to him. The jury deliberated for 3 days, and their questions to the judge suggested they were struggling with the same fundamental question that had divided public opinion. Was Michael Thompson a grieving husband driven to temporary madness by betrayal, or was he a controlling man who chose murder over divorce? The answer would determine whether he spent the rest of his life in prison or whether he might someday walk free to rebuild a relationship with the children who had lost both parents in one terrible night. The verdict came on a gray Thursday afternoon in March 2024. The courtroom was packed with Sarah's family, David's relatives, and Michael's supporters, each group hoping for a different kind of justice. When the jury foreman stood to read the decision, you could hear a pin drop in the room. Michael Thompson was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of David Martinez, but only guilty of second-degree murder in the death of his wife, Sarah Thompson. The distinction was crucial. By convicting Michael of first-degree murder for killing David, the jury had found that he had planned and premeditated at least part of the violence. The threatening messages, the surveillance, the decision to bring a weapon, all evidence that Michael had gone to that Walmart prepared to hurt David Martinez. But by convicting him of only second-degree murder for killing Sarah, the jury acknowledged that his violence against his wife might have been the result of sudden passion rather than careful planning. The judge sentenced Michael to life in prison without the possibility of parole for David's murder, plus an additional 25 years for Sarah's death. At 51 years old, Michael Thompson would never again be a free man. His children, Emma and Jake, would grow up without either parent, their mother dead, their father locked away forever. They were taken in by Sarah's sister and her husband, who promised to help them understand what had happened when they were old enough to process such a complicated tragedy. But the story didn't end with Michael's sentencing. 3 months later, new information came to light that cast doubt on everything the jury had heard during the trial. A former Walmart employee came forward with security footage from inside the store that had somehow been missed during the initial investigation. The footage showed Sarah and David in her office earlier that evening, before the store closed, having what appeared to be an emotional conversation. The video had no audio, but their body language suggested they were discussing something serious and difficult. David appeared to be trying to convince Sarah of something, gesturing toward the door as if suggesting they leave. Sarah seemed conflicted, shaking her head, and then covering her face with her hands. At one point, David reached for her hand, but Sarah pulled away and moved behind her desk, putting physical distance between them. This footage suggested that Sarah and David might have been planning to end their relationship that very night, that Sarah might have finally decided to choose her marriage and her family over her feelings for David. If that was true, then Michael's timing was tragically ironic. He had killed his wife just hours before she might have ended the affair and come home to confess everything and ask for forgiveness. A handwriting expert later analyzed the journal entries in Sarah's diary and determined that the final entry, the one about needing to tell Michael the truth, had been written on the day she died. Sarah Thompson may have gone to work that Tuesday evening planning to have the most difficult conversation of her life with the man she was betraying, and Michael Thompson may have murdered the two people he loved most just hours before his wife was prepared to fight for their marriage. This revelation devastated Michael. In a letter he wrote to the judge requesting a new trial, he said that knowing Sarah might have been planning to end the affair made his actions seem even more senseless and tragic. If he had waited just one more day, if he had found the courage to confront Sarah directly instead of following her to work, if he had chosen trust over suspicion even one time, his wife might still be alive, David Martinez might still be alive, and their children would still have their parents. The request for a new trial was denied. The judge ruled that even if Sarah had been planning to end her relationship with David, Michael's threatening messages and surveillance behavior still demonstrated premeditation and intent to harm. His actions had been the result of weeks of planning, not a single moment of discovery and rage. The original verdict would stand. Today, Michael Thompson serves his life sentence at a maximum security prison in Central Florida. He spends his days working in the prison library, writing letters to Emma and Jake that their guardian decides whether or not to share with them. Sarah's sister says the children ask about their father sometimes, but mostly they seem focused on building a normal life with their new family. Emma is now 11 and plays violin in her school orchestra. Jake is 9 and has inherited his father's love of building things, though he uses Legos instead of lumber. David Martinez's family established a scholarship in his name for single parents pursuing business degrees, recognizing his efforts to rebuild his life after his divorce. Sarah Thompson's coworkers at Walmart created a memorial garden behind the store where employees can take breaks surrounded by flowers and peace instead of concrete and parking lots. The store where the murders occurred was renovated extensively, with Sarah's office converted into a break room and the entire stockroom area redesigned. But employees and customers both report that the building never quite felt the same after that night. The Walmart remains open and busy, a testament to how life continues even in places marked by tragedy. This wasn't just about betrayal or jealousy or the end of a marriage. It was about how quickly love can turn to obsession, how easily suspicion can become rage, and how devastating the consequences can be when we choose violence over communication. Michael Thompson had dozens of opportunities to save his marriage, to protect his family, to seek help for his growing mental health crisis. Instead, he chose to follow his wife to work one night and destroy 3 families in less than 22 minutes. The question that haunts everyone who followed this case isn't whether Michael was guilty. The evidence was overwhelming. The question is whether this tragedy could have been prevented if any of the people involved had made different choices. What if Sarah had been honest about her feelings earlier in the marriage? What if David had transferred to a different store when he realized he was developing feelings for a married woman? What if Michael had sought counseling instead of sending threatening messages? But maybe that's the wrong question entirely. Maybe the real question is why we as a society continue to romanticize jealousy and possessiveness, why we treat crimes of passion as somehow more understandable than other forms of violence, why we expect people to own each other instead of choosing each other freely every day. As we wrap up this story, I want to ask you some difficult questions, and I hope you'll share your thoughts in the comments below. Put yourself in Michael's position for a moment, not to excuse what he did, but to understand how ordinary people can make such extraordinarily destructive choices. If you discovered that your partner of 12 years, the parent of your children, the person you trusted most in the world, was having an affair, what would you do? Would you confront them immediately, demanding an explanation and an end to the relationship? Would you try to gather more evidence before making accusations? Would you contact the other person directly and ask them to step away? Would you seek counseling, either alone or as a couple, to try to understand what went wrong in your relationship? Or would you simply end the marriage and focus on protecting your children from the fallout? Most of us would like to think we'd choose one of those healthier options. Most of us want to believe that we would never resort to violence, that we would never let jealousy and rage control our actions to the point where we destroy the lives of people we claim to love. But the truth is that Michael Thompson probably thought the same thing about himself right up until the moment he picked up that box cutter. And what about Sarah? If you found yourself falling in love with someone other than your spouse, would you have the courage to be honest about those feelings before acting on them? Would you end your marriage first, even knowing the pain it would cause your partner and children? Or would you try to maintain both relationships, hoping somehow that you could avoid having to choose between them? It's easy to judge Sarah for her deception, for the way she continued to sleep next to Michael every night while planning a future with David. But it's also easy to understand her fear of breaking up her family, her hope that maybe her feelings for David were just a phase that would pass, her desire to spare Michael the pain of knowing about her betrayal, if she could somehow end the affair without him ever finding out. None of these human failings and complicated emotions justify what happened in that Walmart stockroom. Nothing Sarah did deserved a death sentence. Nothing David did made him deserving of murder. And nothing Michael felt gave him the right to decide that 2 other people should die rather than live with the consequences of their choices. But understanding how ordinary people can find themselves in extraordinary situations might help us recognize the warning signs in our own lives and relationships. When communication breaks down, when trust erodes, when we start making assumptions about our partner's thoughts and feelings instead of asking direct questions, those are the moments when marriages begin to die, long before anyone picks up a weapon. If you were on the jury in Michael's case, would you have voted to convict him of first-degree murder, second-degree murder, or would you have found him not guilty by reason of temporary insanity? The 12 people who actually served on that jury struggled with this question for 3 days, and their split verdict suggests that even people who heard all the evidence couldn't agree on Michael's level of responsibility for his actions. Let me know in the comments what you think about this case. Do you believe that betrayal can drive someone temporarily insane, or do you think Michael made a calculated decision to choose violence over divorce? Do you think Sarah and David bear any moral responsibility for what happened to them, or were they simply two people who fell in love at the wrong time and paid the ultimate price for it? And here's perhaps the most important question of all. If you saw the warning signs of this kind of situation developing in your own life, or in the life of someone you care about, what would you do? How do we help people who are struggling with infidelity, jealousy, and rage before those emotions turn into something devastating and irreversible? This story isn't just about 3 people in Jacksonville who made terrible choices one October night. It's about all of us and the ways we handle love, betrayal, forgiveness, and revenge. It's about the thin line that separates ordinary people from becoming headlines in stories like this one. If you found this story as compelling and heartbreaking as I did, please hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We dive deep into cases like this one every week, exploring not just what happened, but why it happened, and what we can learn from these tragedies to protect ourselves and the people we love. And if you thought this story was shocking, wait until you hear about the case we're covering next week. A woman in Tampa discovered that her husband of 20 years had been living a double life, complete with a second family, a second home, and a second identity. When she confronted him, he claimed he had no memory of his other life, and the medical evidence suggested he might actually be telling the truth. Was it the most elaborate deception in Florida history, or was this man genuinely suffering from a rare psychological condition that allowed him to compartmentalize his life so completely that even he didn't know who he really was? Subscribe now, and we'll see you next week for another story where truth is stranger and more tragic than fiction. Thanks for watching, and remember, the people we love are never as simple as we think they are, and the choices we make in moments of crisis define not just our own lives but the lives of everyone who trusts us to be better than our worst impulses.